Okay, now immediately on the pause recording.
So today, okay, got it. Yeah, so today in session 3, I'll be focusing on chapter 6, which is the Cyclical Evolution and Reincarnation chapter. I thoroughly enjoyed working on this presentation. The learner and the academic in me was, it was a lot of fun, and it was just really, it was a wonderful opportunity for me to expand my knowledge as well to the concept of reincarnation. I'm still fairly new to it, and I will explain further on in the slides as to why. So I'll be sharing some of my own personal journey and examples of how I moved from someone who was not aware of the idea of reincarnation, and then when I first heard about it, to utter denial, to now going, yep, I know it exists, and it's something that I have fully embraced. All right, so we're going to start with the, if I could just move on to the next slide. Simon, thank you very much. So in a nutshell, what I will be doing is that I will be laying the groundwork of what reincarnation is, its context, and its origin and its evolution. But we have to start at the beginning, which is looking at evolution and how it operates or how it flows. And reading this chapter, and it's just a really beautiful way of explaining that evolution does not proceed linearly, but in cycles. And so that is the starting point for the talk today. And this is something that we will be coming back over and over again as I take you through the slide deck. And essentially what it is talking about is that life expresses itself, creates forms, experiences, and then retracts. It goes inward, and then it bounces back again. So when we're talking about cycles, I want you to, and this applies for pretty much everything. And a really good example to get our head really embedded within the concept is, the writer talks about, or he gives the analogy of a tree. So we have the example of a tree and how it goes through its various cycles, through seasons and through years. So every spring it starts to blossom, it starts to get its flowers, and then in summer it's in full bloom. And then as we proceed into autumn, we notice that it starts to shed its leaves, and it starts to retract, and it starts getting ready for hibernation. So it's essentially that very simple idea of retracting, then going into hibernation, then rebirth, and then blossoming, and then all over again. When we look at the tree and the cycles it goes through, it looks the same in appearance, but every season or every cycle, it is different. It is robust, it is perhaps bigger, more stronger, more grounded. So it's just that very concept that it might look same in appearance, but it's different every time the cycle starts anew. I love this quote by HPB, that's from The Secret Doctrine, that I thought that would be really good to get us started with the talk tonight, which is, intracosmic motion is eternal and ceaseless. So the cycles that are happening all around in the universe, can the cosmic planes, they're eternal, they're transcendental, and they are always happening ceaseless. Cosmic motion, the visible, or that which is subject to perception, human perception in this aspect, is finite and periodical. And I think that's a really, really beautiful way to take us into what exactly cyclic evolution is and how that ties into reincarnation. Next slide, Simon. Thank you. So So when we talk about cyclic evolution and reincarnation, we do have to start, when I talked about that, we talk about the origins and everything, it is also starting at, so we're looking at what does it exactly mean for us, or how do we understand that from a human mind? So if you look all around us in terms of matter and energy, they all operate in cycles. You have everything turns, everything beats, everything vibrates. The planets, they revolve around their axis, and then they revolve around the sun, and they're part of the solar system, and the galaxy, and it's all cycles. They're all going through their motions. I wanted to actually share a beautiful example that I found. I was on Instagram the other day, and I follow NASA and a lot of the findings that they do because I'm fascinated by space. And they had captured infrared image of a black hole. And I believe just a few days ago, scientists also were able to discover the black hole that's at the center of the Milky Way. And it was just really fascinating that even though light bends, even though the matter and the energy, when it's going towards black hole, it might bend because of the gravitational pull and all that aspect, it's still going around in cycles. So that's a really beautiful way of looking at, this is how the universe, this is how the cosmic plane or the platform also operates. And even when we look around us, when it comes to light, when it comes to infrared rays, the radio, the television signals that we use in our mobile phones, and the Wi-Fi, they're all electromagnetic waves, and they're all happening in cycles. So our modern life is very much embedded within that cycles that matter and energy operate in. And then when we look at quantum physics, to put it very easy and understandable terms, there was a discovery of particles. And it's really interesting because it talks about the dual nature of particles. So what scientists discovered was that particles are both a wave and a particle. And that's a very fascinating thing when we're talking about cycles and how they affect pretty much everything around us, because essentially by having that duality, what they're saying is that while a particle might be located within a certain point in the cosmic fabric, it also operates as waves that are distributed throughout space, and they interact with other waves that are also particles. So it's a very beautiful way of looking at how everything just moves in cycles and how everything that's how evolution cooperates when we really start digging into it. I wanted to share a really interesting phenomenon with you guys that I thought that would be really good, especially on this slide, which is quantum entanglement. Now, this is a very bizarre phenomenon that the scientists actually discovered a few years back, which essentially says that when two or more particles link up in a certain way, whether that's through waves, whether that's electromagnetic waves, etc., no matter how far apart they are in space, so they could be on two very separate ends of the universe or of the galaxy, they will remain linked forever because they share a common unified state. So I found that really fascinating, that no matter what happens, it's like they are caught in a cycle with each other. Again, the cyclical aspect of evolution. Next slide. Simon, thank you. Cool. So the next bit talks about how when we really start noticing and we start putting the pieces together, we see that nature, humans, societies, and civilizations, they've all operated in cycles. So when we look at ourselves, or when we look at the biology of us, You know, there's cycles of breathing, the heartbeat, the cycles of our metabolism, the hormonal cycles in certain organisms. Then we have the circadian cycle, that is when we wake up or when we go to sleep, according to day and night, the brain waves, and then of course the cycle of birth and death. So that's a very, very organic way of looking at it, that we ourselves in our physical form go through various cycles. When we look at nature, when we look at planet Earth, there are cycles in terms of cycles of water, how oxygen is created, and then like how it makes its way through into the atmosphere. The water becomes into clouds and then rain and then all over again. And then a really good example is social cycles of like how societies goes through ebbs and flows or cycles, and oscillations. And then obviously history is filled with the rise and fall of empires. You know, a new civilization or a new empire is built on the remains of a new one. So it's a really, once we really start looking, you see the aspect of cycles pretty much everywhere around us. And everything around us seems to have that cyclical nature. And they form a wonderful combination and constitute the cycles of life on planet Earth, of nature, of societies, of civilization. And I'm sure that you have heard this term and probably also had a talk about it. I know that I've had a lot of chats about it, that time is not linear, but it's actually cyclical. It's something that I, as a lover of philosophy, I came across a few years back, and it really stood, it really stuck by me. It's a concept of the eternal recurrence theory by Nietzsche. And I'm not going to quote him, but what I have done is I put in a quotation from one of my favorite TV shows, True Detective, that came out in 2014. And it's peppered with philosophical stuff. And there's a lot of emphasis on the cycles that human beings and societies go through. So I added a quote that I thought would be relevant for the session today, which is, time is a flat circle. Everything we've ever done or will do, we're going to do it over and over again. Now, you can take this in the literal sense, and we can get very morbid about it, or you can take it in a sense where you accept, yeah, everyone goes through cycles, or in a very esoteric and a spiritual sense, which is how I have taken this quote, is, for instance, in this lifetime, I am trying to release or let go a certain wounding or a trauma that I've had in this lifetime. Or you could say a trigger. And essentially what is going to happen is you're going to keep coming back to that trauma, to that trigger, or to that wounding until the lesson has been learned or the karmic debt has been paid. Or you're not triggered anymore. Or you can look at that wounding, or you can look at that trauma and go, yeah, I acknowledge it for what it is. There's no pain, or there's no suffering, or there's no attachment to it. So you respond to it rather than react to it. So this is where I apply this quote, is like, until you learn the lesson, you're going to keep coming back. And it could be very well where you go, wait, I was at this point last year. Why am I being faced with the same context or the same situation, but probably with different people, or probably with different elements, but it's the same lesson that's coming up. So it's just, and that's a really beautiful way of looking at how time is not linear, but it's that it is cyclical. I definitely think that time is a man-made concept, because we really do go in circles until the lesson has been learned or we're not triggered anymore. So yeah, that's a really good example of how we look at evolution and the cycles that consist of it. Next slide, Simon. Thank you. So we're still talking about just the the origins of where cyclical evolution has come from and what the scientists have said about it and what people have written about it before we jump into reincarnation. So there's this really interesting concept called cyclical cosmology. And it essentially talks about, and it was penned, one of the foremost scientists around that, essentially what this theory or concept of how we approach the universe and how we approach the cyclical aspect of evolution is. We essentially what the theory says is that we go through a cycle, or the universe goes through a cycle, where in this instance, our universe will go through a birth, i.e. the Big Bang, and then it will contract and disappear, hence the big crunch. And then everything will start all over again, or it will bounce back, called the big bounce. And that essentially is, in a nutshell, what the theory is about, that even the universe goes through cycles. And Professor Penrose has been a huge advocate of this theory, and his stance on this has been quite daring, innovative, and it's still very much in discussion, because essentially what this theory or what the stance is doing it is shifting us away from a very egocentric view of the universe, which is philosophically unsustainable and not applicable. That says that very much that the universe is happening at an accelerated expansion. It will cool down at some point, and then that will be the end of the world or the dark night of the universe, and that's it. But the reason why it's egocentric is because it very much places human or humanity or mankind at the center of that all. So that one-time model can be seen as very ego-driven. But if you take Penrose's stance, he actually says that's not the case. The universe certainly does not depend on mankind or humans on how it operates. It has its own cycle that it has been going through regardless of whatever happens. And essentially what his theory says is that he says that each cycle of the universe is called an eon. And the duration of that is about 10 multiplied 100 times of Earth years by itself. So a very long time. And essentially what he has shown through his research, which is really fascinating, is that he captured X-ray, like he captured, I believe that he captured through radiation and space probes, he was able to capture the first echo of the Big Bang. And by doing that, he showed that there has been not one Big Bang, but there has been two previous Big Bang from the one that is current, and that's how the current reality is. So if that's the case, and if you look at the picture on the slide, it's two circles. They are very subtle but concentrated circles, i.e. cycles. So essentially what Penrose is saying is the universe also goes through cycles, and we are just part of another cycle, another Big Bang that the universe is going through. Next slide, Simon. Thank you. I really like this quote, so I added this in the presentation because I thought that it's a really good addition to laying the groundwork. And it says, if you have a universe that is cyclical, it's eternal, so you don't have to explain the beginning. And in that way, you don't have to explain the end, because it is in constant motion. It doesn't cease, as the quote by HPB was at the beginning of this slide. There's no end and there's no beginning. It just keeps on going. So that's a very different way of looking of how the universe breathes and lives. And it's certainly not dependent on us. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So moving on. Now we move on to some Eastern philosophy and ideas when it comes to cyclic evolution. Now, when I was reading through the chapter and making up the presentation, I know a lot of you on the call have been to the Hilma Clint exhibition here in Wellington. And if you would remember, she's really fascinated by spirals, or they show up as snails in her paintings. And we know that she was very much in correspondence with spirit, and that is reflected in her work. And they represented for her development or evolution as well. So I think that was a really interesting connection right there as well with the spirals. So here on this slide, we have the Vedas and them talking about what the cyclic evolution, what it stands for and what it means in that context. And essentially what it says is, the Vedas say that the universe manifests and retires periodically. So the universe goes through a succession of periods of manifestation and activity called the Manvantara. And then it goes through periods of rest, latency, or just assimilation, you could say, called the Pralaya. And it's a really interesting way of looking at it, because what you see on the slide is a spiral of just like how essentially it goes in cycles. And what the Vedas say is that the absolute expresses itself by manifesting itself periodically, giving rise to the appearance of a universe with beings and matters. It also refers as the universal cycles, or the days and the nights of the Brahma. So when it's manifesting, the universe is experiencing its day cycle. And when it retires, it's experiencing its night cycle. And that's a really interesting concept to even look at, that you had these ancient Eastern religions that had also figured this out, that this is how the universe behaves and this is how it operates. And we also have, I believe it was the philosopher Plato who talked about this as well in his dialogues, and he got vilified and criticized for it. Then the German philosopher Immanuel Kant talked about the universal cycles as well, which is really, really interesting. So before I go on to Immanuel Kant, very quickly, what the Vedas also talk about is the essence, which is the noumenon, which is behind every phenomenon. So the phenomenon is something that we experience. So essentially what the Vedas say is that behind every phenomenon, there's a noumenon that drives it, that drives the manifestation. So Immanuel Kant, funny enough, a little bit of trivia, he was one of the philosophers that I used for my PhD. So he was the one philosopher that I read nonstop for 5 years. And he talks about his concept of pure reason, which is in the Critique of Pure Reason that came out in 1791, I believe. And in a nutshell, what he says is that behind every knowable experience or knowable world, in this case, the human world, what we experience, there is an essence. Again, the Vedas talk about the essence here. So he says the noble world, the knowable world, what we experience every day as humans, is the phenomenon. But behind it is the essence or structure you could imagine that we cannot see through human experience, or we cannot feel through human experience. So it's something that is beyond the human mind or the human experience. So in short, what he's saying is everything is required by the law of cyclical manifestation, and human beings are not an exception. So even we experience it. And there are some things that, which is the noumenon in this aspect, which is the essence, we cannot, on a human aspect, fully comprehend or see or feel, but it exists. And it is what drives and feeds into the manifestation, which is the phenomenon or the human experience that we have every single day while living in this reality. Next slide, Simon. Thank you. So with that in mind, moving on, just really quickly, we will look also at the aspect of cycles within cycles, which in a nutshell says that small cycles reproduce on a smaller scale what happens in the major cycles. And this talks about, how a fern will have the same patterns or the same formations as its tree trunk. So it's like it's all pretty much connected. And this is what it's, again, what this slide is reminding us again is, even if it's small cycles that are part of a bigger cycle, they're all interconnected. So there are relations of similarity among all of them. And if we apply this law of cycles to human beings, to us, we see that it is natural that we also go through a cycle every lifetime, the physical life, being born and death. And so it's something not unique. And in that way, us going through our life cycle is just one small cycle that is part of a bigger cycle that is happening around us. So that's a really beautiful way of connecting and showing how everything is familiar and how it falls into place. Okay. Now, from the next few slides, we're going to be talking about reincarnation. So I've laid the groundwork. And next slide, please. Simon, thank you very much. So, reincarnation, essentially what it is, and what do we know about it? So if in nature everything acts in cycles, reincarnation is very much the same concept, that the soul returns to reincarnate after the physical death has happened. And essentially what it says is, when kind of gives a really good example again is, if we were to think that all the water that is being evaporated from the earth and to become into clouds, and then it becomes rain and it passes through the mountains and the valleys and the rivers, if it was to never return again to being a bed of river and then meeting the ocean, that it would have just one opportunity and that's it. That would be the opposite of reincarnation. So how the water returns to the earth through rain, and as it passes through the mountains and the valleys, and it becomes part of the river and then the ocean, and then it evaporates again into the cloud. That's a very beautiful way of looking at reincarnation, because we go through the same thing every lifetime. And essentially, when we look at reincarnation, what it does is, the spiritual soul or the internal being, it does not manifest itself in just one single body, but takes different successive reincarnations or rebirth in a different body with different memories, mind, and emotion. And we get to experience every lifetime differently. There's trauma, there's suffering, there's love, there's challenges, there's opportunity. Every lifetime or every reincarnation, there are different lessons, there are different challenges, there are different opportunities, there are different experiences. So what's the point of all of this? It is for the spiritual soul, or for the internal being, to develop its potentialities, for it to ascend, for it to learn, for it to grow. I see reincarnation as a doorway that we go through every time we choose to reincarnate. It's the development of the spiritual soul each time we go through a reincarnation. And in this way, we're not limited by a single opportunity. So again, I talked about this earlier. Time being linear is a human concept, or in this way, very much a concept of the mind. So if we put that out of the window and we say, okay, so reincarnation, so we have a different life every time we reincarnate, or our soul reincarnates, and it's not a single time opportunity, but it is many opportunities for us to learn, for us to grow, for us to develop, for us to have experiences. And again, in that way, it's a cycle that after every reincarnation, after every cycle, the soul develops more. And through all of this, the soul learns from experience and grows inwardly. It grows in knowledge. And that feeds into the essence of our soul, of who we are really at the core, to fully experience the human experience through multiple opportunities and just not one. Next slide, please, Simon. Thank you. So this slide talks about what happens in the process of reincarnation. So you have the Atma, you have the Buddhi, and you have the higher manas, which is the will, intuition, and intelligence. And they play a part when we talk about reincarnation. So HPB says that, of course, she talks about that the human soul, constituted or driven by these higher principles of Atma, and Buddhi, and the higher manas, is manifested through a new personality in each reincarnation. So essentially, what does she say in very simpler terms? Essentially, what she says is that once we go through the physical death, we get into this dream state, which is called the Devachan. In Sanskrit, it literally means the abode of the gods, or it means being in that dream state. And in this beautiful dream state, we go through a transformation, and we also go through assimilation. So once we've had the physical death, in this period of dream state, the assimilation is assimilating all the past memories and the experiences that we had in the previous life that we have just departed from. So there's a transformation happening because the soul is taking and integrating that. And that transformation and assimilation needs to go through before the soul can be ready for the next incarnation. And then when it's ready for the next incarnation, you have the lower mana, which is the concrete mind, the kama, which is the desire, emotion, and the prana, the vitality. That is what drives the incarnation into a new physical body in the form of a baby. And the most interesting thing is, the new personality or the new incarnation is born with amnesia. You have no previous memory of your past life, even though those memories reside in the higher planes that the inner being or we can access. But essentially, every reincarnation, we must learn to adapt again to our environment. We have to have new experiences, new memories, new emotions. But while we might not have the memories of the past lives, We carry over the qualities and the wisdoms from those past lives, and they show up in very subtle and powerful forms as we go through that incarnation. So it's a very beautiful way of looking of how we go through a physical death, we contract, which is the Devachan, which is the dream state. And once when we're ready to bounce back again, we go through a new incarnation into a new body. But with the amnesia of not knowing the memories of the past life. And what the physical death does is it's a desolation, it's the dissolving of the old personality. So a clean slate. Imagine that you have to go to school as a new student every year. So you have to start from scratch. That's essentially what reincarnation is. Next slide, Simon. And this is a beautiful quote from the Bhagavad Gita, which says, as a man discards old clothes and dresses in new ones, so the body dweller leaves the old body and enters a new one. And this is a very beautiful way of describing reincarnation. You discard those old clothes, you throw them away, and you just put on a new outfit. But the soul remains the same. So you might look different in those new clothes, but the essence of the soul, the internal being, remains the same. And that is the focus, or that is the purpose of every reincarnation, in my humble view, is to remember who we are at the essence, to remember who we are at the core, who we are as a soul being. The physical body is just a meat suit. It's one of many opportunities that we are given or we take. Next slide, Simon. Thank you. So, yeah, essentially it is the school of life. It can be very challenging, it can be exhausting, and at the same time, it can be really, really rewarding. And through many incarnations, we become increasingly aware of the potentiality of our inner being. We become aware of the divinity within us. We become aware of our essence and of our soul. It's the remembering. That's how I call it. It's remembering who you really are before society told you what you should be. It's remembering where you have come from. And it can show up as that inner knowing of being here before, or being here on this planet Earth for so long or far too long. And it is something that I have experienced in the past 8 years, where I've been like, yep, I've been here for far too long. And I did not really understand what that meant, but my soul did. Because there were moments, and I still have moments, I look at something and I go like, yep, I've gone through this before, but just not this lifetime. Or I've been faced with a certain scenario, but just not this lifetime. It feels familiar. My soul remembers the experience, even though my mind cannot fully comprehend it immediately. It's that inner knowing of being here before, or being here on this planet Earth, going through many reincarnations and going, oh, I've been here for a very long time. You just have that familiarity. And again, what comes through that is, if you get the remembering and you have that inner knowing comes, if you get the call, and it also depends how many reincarnations you've had and what lessons and experiences you have picked up for that spiritual development of the soul, it is we develop faculties or qualities such as sympathy or courage. And then we go like, I don't remember having these qualities, but they seem really familiar. And they arise from the development of the spiritual soul. So a really good example is the genius of Mozart. He was really good at what he did. He was, he created lots of pieces. He was hailed as a genius of his time. And people go like, yep, his father taught him and he had his training. But there was something innate in him that made him produce all that music as if it was familiar to him. And that is something that, again, the noble world or the human mind cannot fully fathom. So essentially what I'm asking you is to step outside and go, yeah, when it comes to a concept like reincarnation, yes, logic is absolutely healthy and it's part of the human experience, but you have to put it aside, because only then you can go through the doorway of really fully opening yourself to the fact is, oh, this is just not this one life. There's more to than just meat suit or this physical body. There's more to who I am. There's a divinity that resides within me. Next slide. Simon, thank you. So we've been talking about reincarnations and about the concept of reincarnation. And another really good example that I wanted to give you was, and before I forget, because I'm just looking at my notes, is I gave a talk on Saint Germain a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about his reincarnations. One of his reincarnations was Plato, then another one was Merlin, and then the last one was Sir Francis Bacon before he became an ascended master. And there was something really fascinating that I read was Plato was one of the very few philosophers or thinkers who mentioned Atlantis. And people thought it was a myth or something that he made up. But one of the reincarnations of Saint Germain was as a priest in Atlantis, at one of the temples. So it makes you think Plato remembered or had a memory that he had an incarnation of Atlantis. And he left a clue, or he mentioned that in his work for future reincarnations to pick that up, and for the world to know that this is something that he had experienced, and he probably could not do it openly. So he padded that up in his philosophical writings. So that's a really good example of looking at reincarnation again, and how people or figures over history and time have looked at, have dealt with it. So when we talk about reincarnation, it's not a new concept. It's been here for thousands of years. It was also common in some thinkers in early days of Christianity as an inheritance of paganism, until it was declared anathema at the Council of Constantinople in the year 553. And I already mentioned Plato and like how he is related to reincarnations as well. And this is, can I firmly believe he was just remembering stuff, or he was familiar with the concept, and he put that in his teachings because his soul had spiritually developed at a point where it was like, yep, it happens. So I want to leave clues and signs for people. Now, I had mentioned, so there have been numerous studies done on it. Gallup has done a poll, for example, in Western Europe, and that's something, so the reason I put that on the slide was because I grew up in Western Europe, in Switzerland. So if you look at it, Switzerland, 36% of the people there actually believe in reincarnation, 41% in Iceland, and 20% in Spain. So there are people who are aware on very much a soul level, or even on a conscious level, that this happens, that we go through cycles. Now, I mentioned earlier about my own experience with reincarnation and how I was totally unaware of the idea, moving on to being a firm believer in it. And the progression is because I grew up as a Muslim. And in Islam, we don't believe in reincarnation. We say that time is linear and you just have this one life, a single opportunity to make the best of it. And then you have a physical death, and then you are judged on Judgment Day, and that's it. So having grown up in an organized religion like Islam that considers reincarnation blasphemous, to moving to a space where I firmly believe in it required for me to step outside my comfort zone and to put my conditioning and my logic aside. Because my soul was speaking to me and saying to me, this is not your first gig. You've been here for so many times and you know it. Why are you ignoring what your intuition is telling you? And that was triggering. Absolutely triggering. But there came a point where I could not deny what my internal being was saying to me. So I took that step. And joining the TS has certainly helped me embrace that aspect of me and really helped me and directed me in digging in some of my past lives, because I was curious. Like, I wanted to know why I chose to reincarnate this lifetime. What was my purpose? What's the purpose of my soul? If that could help me with my why, then I would be able to serve and be of service to humanity. And that would be part of my soul's evolution. Again, looking at that aspect of, I'm going through a cycle. My soul has chosen this reincarnation. So what am I here to learn? What am I here to experience? And what am I here to contribute to the evolution of the cycle of humanity? Next slide, Simon. So the next few slides are just talking about, is there evidence when it comes to reincarnation? And that's a very scientific way of looking at it. People have done studies, and because I've said before, one really has to think outside the reason box and look at the essence or the unseen. And yes, there's no conclusive scientific evidence, but they're very significant indicators. One of the concepts is hypnotic regression, or you might meet someone and they seem very familiar to you. And there has been spontaneous perceptions, and there's also the testimony of children who are being born and they remember their past life very vividly. Again, it shows how spiritually developed their soul is. Next slide, Simon. So now we're pretty much talking about the unexplained reasoning or indicators that you might have that reincarnation has happened from a human aspect. So unexplained can a country or a culture. I'm a testimony of that. I came to New Zealand 5 years ago on a trip. And as soon as I got off the plane, I was like, I'm home. I was like, wait, I've never been to this country. I've never been to this land, but it feels so familiar. And literally 5 months later, I packed my bags and I moved to the other side of the world because my soul was like, you're going home. And that's why, as Simon introduced me in my bio, New Zealand is my spiritual home, because I had an unexplainable pull to the land. And as I did more past life research, and I did a lot of my past life traveling that I've done myself, astrally and through my meditations, I realized that one of my first incarnations was in New Zealand, coming full circle for a cycle. So essentially my soul called me back home to where I first chose to incarnate. So it's something that I cannot explain. Certainly my parents don't understand that, but I know it to be true because I don't miss Europe. I know I'm home. This is it. So it could also be a connection with another person where you meet them and you go, I know you, but it's the first time I've met you. It's that pull because you've probably experienced a past life together, the longing of a place or a culture, the sense of deja vu. You go to a country or you go to a place and you go, I've been here before, certainly not this lifetime. Or as I say it, the tingling sensation or inner knowing, that feeling of familiarity or deja vu. So those are all unexplained affections of a reincarnation, of that your soul has been here before. And there are various ways of retrieving that or touching those memories or experiencing those memories again. Next slide, Simon. So one of the ways that you can do it is through hypnotic regression. It was one of the leading persons on that is Dr. Brian Weiss, and he's the author of the book Many Lives, Many Masters. And essentially what he has done is he tells the stories of one of his patients whom he called Catherine, that he obtained through hypnotic regression. And it is a therapeutic and a research technique where the subject or the person is induced into a hypnotic trance. And when they're in a trance state, the therapist asks them to try to remember, can relate events from their previous reincarnations. And it might be one reincarnation or past life that might be relevant to the session, or many. It depends again. So it's a very subjective way of looking at reincarnation. And Wyeth, who initially did not believe in reincarnation, was converted once he started doing this work. Again, people have very differing views about it, and it can be really unreliable. And that's very much from the view is that the subject can be under the influence of a therapist, or stories and memories can come up as past life memories, but they are very much stories or memories that are based in fear or trauma from your current life. So it's very easy to distort or have a very fantasy view of what you are being shown. So yeah, it's a very I'm not going to say a gray matter, but yeah, it's a very unreliable way, and it requires a place of trust and being with someone that you fully trust, and also really knowing what you're experiencing and what you're seeing is just not your ego or your subconscious projecting onto you, but really you're being shown a past life. And what I do is, when I have done past life work, is I'll ask for something very specific. So I'll ask Spirit, show me or tell me something very specific that my ego or my mind won't be able to make up. I don't have to understand it fully, or I don't have to comprehend it, but I'll know that it'll be something very specific. Can I be shown or be told something very specific? Can I be like, yeah, I cannot make this up. And my mind cannot fully understand it. That means for me, yep, it's true. Next slide. So, and this is also looking at other perceptions when we talk about reincarnation. So you can also you can experience them as visions or flashbacks that can be activated by an event, either through trauma or shock. They can also appear in meditations, or you can also do use modalities like Akashic readings as well. So there are different ways and pathways and modalities where you could actually open that doorway and look into what past lives are. Next slide. These are the last two slides, guys. So I'm just looking at the time as well. So this is a really cool example of some of the research that has been done on past lives. And this guy, Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, carried out a scientific research for a number of years on the past lives of children. Over 3,000 cases of children who said they remembered a previous life and very vividly. And he published that in scientific journals. It was a very methodical and rigorous research where he asked for research, where he asked for signs, and he looked at forensic reports, and he looked at fraudulent behavior just to make sure that what the kids were telling him was not made up stuff. And then he also looked at the study of birthmarks, because what he noticed, the majority of the kids, the children that he was studying or doing research upon, their past life had ended due to violent death. And essentially what they had carried on was they had carried on birthmarks from that experience, or they had carried on marks as birthmarks in the current life from that previous life. And science, or from a logical point of view, it does not have an explanation, but there's stuff out there, stuff like Dr. Ian Stevenson's publication that shows that reincarnation does happen. And he's published and he's carried on research to show that. Next slide, which is the last one. So when we look at reincarnation in a nutshell, it explains the contradictions, the many facts and cycles of life and lifetimes that we live as a soul. The evolving soul may be infinite or mature. And so every reincarnation you go through, like you've heard of that term, that person's an old soul or their mature soul. And that's just an indication that their soul has gone through a lot of development due to many reincarnations that they have experienced. The purpose of the reincarnation is for the inner being to learn. It changes our perspective of life and how we look at life. At least in my view, it's made me realize, okay, two things. I do have not this one single opportunity to make the most of it, which means that I am an eternal being or infinite being that's going through cycles, and I will have perhaps many more opportunities to experience this human life. And yet at the same time, it's also made me present to fully enjoy the current reincarnation I have and not to take anything for granted, to fully experience the memories, the lessons, everything that this reincarnation is throwing at me, to fully experience that, because this is going to add and this is going to help in the development of my soul. And it's like imagining yourself as a lotus flower that blooms, even though its roots are in the mud, but it's like every time it blooms, it's like it's a new reincarnation. And so it's a long-term project. Again, time is not linear in this. Time does not matter, not the human concept when we talk about the evolution of the inner being. And this incarnation, we have the opportunity to bring a very important value to that project, which is the evolution of the soul, which in my view is coming back to who we are, coming back to our divinity. And that is it for me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Arzoo. Wonderful.